I'm going to introduce ourselves as a panel. We'll hand over to you, and if you can just introduce yourselves for the record as well, and then we'll proceed with the rest of this hearing. So I'm Deputy Montfort-Taddy, I'm the panel chair.
Deputy Karen Wilson.
Deputy Jeff Sutherland, Vice Chair.
Deputy Max Andrews.
Okay, I'm Deputy Kirsten Morel, Minister for Sustainable Economic Development.
I'm Charlotte Howe and I'm Sector Officer for Visitor Economy and Retail.
And Tom Holby, the Chief Economic Advisor for the Government of Jersey.
Thank you. Thanks for introducing yourselves and welcome to the meeting. We appreciate you coming in to talk to us. So just to give some context, we're a few months into this review already. We've had perhaps a surprising number of submissions in the sense it seems to have caught the public imagination. We've also heard from stakeholders from various different backgrounds and industry representatives, and we're pleased to get some ministerial input today because we've been waiting, I suppose, to also hear from the government in terms of the collective views, if you like, but also the individual views, Minister, which may in some cases differ. So we know that you might have personal opinions as a citizen or a minister or as an individual states member, and we know that as a collective there might be other ministerial considerations which you can give us in terms of our considerations. So let's just launch into our questions, if that's okay. So it might seem like a fairly broad question to start off, but could you briefly outline your understanding of the use of different payment methods as they currently exist in Jersey?
Okay, so there's no doubt that we've moved into a world of many different payment methods. As I grew up, when I was really young, there's just cash and cheques. I remember ATMs coming to Jersey and suddenly queuing at the ATM with my mum to get cash out of the bank, but it's still just cash, just a means of accessing it. And then I'd say most of my life, that's the way it stayed until much more recent years, and particularly with COVID. I think we saw then the acceleration of the use of electronic payments, and there are a wide range of electronic payments. There's various companies. I'll try not to advertise companies, but obviously some companies, we know them almost like Hoover and vacuum cleaners. We know them in the same way, but there are just electronic payment providers that you can use online. Equally, you can use your cards, your credit and debit cards. You can use them directly as cards, or again, you can have them added to your phone and easily make transactions with your phone. And we're now seeing new players coming into the game which aren't banks, but which enable payments. And so I know many islanders have cards from a particular company which just enables transactions really quickly and easily with the use of that card, which is effectively preloaded with credit. And that also enables them to go around the world and reduce their transaction fees. So we've gone from cash and cheques to cash, cheques, and multiple forms of electronic payment, including another one is just simple, a cash transfer from one person to another directly to their bank accounts.
Yeah, thank you. This isn't in our question plan, but I'm wondering whether, because we've also got your some of your officers here with us, whether it might be worth just looking at what cash is, in a sense, maybe in a quasi-philosophical, but also in a political sense. So if we just set the context that we're talking about effectively paper and metal cash that's in circulation. And insofar as Jersey's concerned, when cash is issued in Jersey, to what extent is it the Jersey government that's issuing that cash?
Ooh, that's a very good question and better aimed at the Treasury Department than it is.
Yeah.
I don't know if you...
And we will ask
a Treasury thing, and you'll ask that later.
We will ask them that.
But it's at the bank's request, and there will be a certain control over the money that's put into the system. And there is a complete cap of the money that's effectively in the account that is allowable for cash as well. Yeah. The technicalities the Treasury will be better to answer those questions.
No, that's fine. We will ask them that. So there's a sense in which, in all of this, the panel has received, as I said, a lot of submissions, And there's clearly a lot of, this is a charged subject, there's a lot of emotion attached to the subjects and strong feelings on certain parts, some of it's opinion, some of it's factual, and it will be for the panel to, which we are, looking at that, weighing the evidence accordingly. But there's a sense in which people's individual capital or wealth is always abstract, and therefore the cash is simply an outward manifestation of that in a particular form, but it's not an exclusive form. So this is really what we're looking at, is how people might spend that paper and metal cash, just to contextualise. So the next question then in that context is that there have been some differences, there's been differences in those taking part in the review regarding the choice of the consumer and the choice of the business provider. So what I think we mean by that is that up until this point, we've had a lot of submissions saying that the panel or government should take action to make sure that cash is always accepted by all businesses. We've not had any witnesses so far come to us in person and saying that we should go down that route and that government should legislate. They've all stopped short of that, even the ones who are perhaps more pro-cash and who don't want to see a cashless society, certainly not at the moment. And we've also had people saying that it should be
put onto businesses to ensure that they have to take cash. This is in contrast, I believe, to the European Union. And I don't know the name of the directive, the reference of the directive, but I believe in the European Union, if somebody presents cash for payment, I believe there is an obligation on the business to accept that as payment. And in a sense, that has created a firming up of the idea of legal tender. And I think this is something that's really important, is I'm not even convinced we have a definition around the term legal tender. And what does that mean? So at the moment in Jersey, we are definitely in a position of, businesses are able to choose. They can accept cash, they can accept, and cash only. They can accept electronic payments only, or they can accept both. One of the reasons we've not come forward with a kind of particular policy to change that is because the idea that we believe that businesses can use that as a competitive differentiator. For some businesses, they may wish to only accept electronic payments because they feel that that's what their customers want, but other businesses may feel that they should accept both in order to give their customers the wider choice. Personally, I sit in a category that if I were running a business, I would like to think that I would offer both, because I think that is how you're going to please the wider range of customers. But there's no doubt we've seen a vast drop-off in the amount of cash transactions in Jersey. And so that in itself, then I would suggest encourages businesses to move towards electronic payments only, because fewer and fewer customers are coming forward demanding cash.
Yeah. Did you accept the argument that if it's simply left to the market, and we say people can choose, so if a certain coffee shop doesn't accept cash, you might go to the next coffee shop. That argument's fine up until all coffee shops don't accept cash.
Exactly right.
So at what point, and if ever, is there an argument, a valid argument, that says actually government needs to intervene to stop that critical point passing where there is no choice left for consumers?
So I'll definitely speak personally here, if that's okay, as opposed to from a government policy perspective. I think we're kind of almost potentially in the two-stage process. So first of all, I do think there's a need to get assurance from government, whether that's through legislation or another way. But the only real assurance could come from legislation, in my view, that the government will ensure there is cash in supply. I think I particularly worry about a day when the government says, you know what, we're not going to issue cash anymore. I think that creates a problem for us as members of our society. The second stage, if we did bring that in and say, in perpetuity, government must ensure cash is in supply in Jersey. The second stage then would be about looking at whether you want to impact on the freedom of choice of businesses. At the moment, I think we're in a place where enough businesses are accepting cash for it not to be a problem and not to need to regulate. But there may come a point where if we're heading towards 100% of businesses are accepting only electronic payments, then we might want to say, actually, because we know there are people in the society who want to use cash, who prefer using cash for very good reasons, that they need to be protected in that way.
Is there not a risk about government intervening too late in that process? Because if you only intervene when, if you intervene when 90% of businesses have gone cashless, that's presumably much more disruptive, and
You're absolutely
in order to implement that. So,
You're absolutely right.
at what point is there any ideological and stroke practical consideration being given in government about if there's an appetite for intervention, and if so, when and how?
I don't believe there's been a discussion in government, not one that I'm privy to, around those, around that idea. I think you're absolutely right, Chair, that it does kind of move into the ideological area, in the sense that when I look at myself and say, so Kirsten, as Economic Development Minister, why aren't you lobbying for all businesses in Jersey to have to accept cash? I would say I do trip up on the ideological kind of freedom of choice perspective, and say, at the moment, I don't want to get in the way of that freedom of choice. There is also that perspective that I hold, that at the moment there is excessive regulation in Jersey that makes it very difficult to do business, not particularly around cash, just a general excess of regulation in Jersey. And so the idea of bringing in an extra regulation to put on is not somewhere that I want to go. So in one sense, I would accept that there's an ideological part of me which is stopping me really pushing forward in that second stage.
Do you accept that one can't have it both ways? So if you accept that there needs to be choice, you either have to side with businesses to be able to choose what they want to do, or you give the choice to the customer. Because if, as a customer going into a shop which either doesn't accept card or cash, or one or the other, then I'm immediately excluded from choice as a customer, as a consumer. So is it a case of we either do nothing, and we will have to potentially make recommendations as a panel based on the evidence we've been given, and perhaps on our own considerations. It seems to me that there are three scenarios: do nothing, or we legislate one way or the other, or we actually encourage or legislate. So maybe really two scenarios there.
I mean, I think there are. I think it's right for us to have the discussion. I think it would be better to have a wider discussion, and for that reason, I'm really pleased that the scrutiny panel has picked this up, because I think we do need to have that discussion, because I think what you're highlighting, what you, Chair, I think have correctly highlighted is, when 90% of all businesses in Jersey, if there comes a time when 95% of all accepting only electronic payments, to then require them to move back to accepting cash would require an element of disruption and change, which would be costly to those businesses, I assume. And so getting ahead of that and having the discussions now rather than later, I think is really, really important.
And is there an argument for maybe targeted and temporary intervention? So say government might say, until we've got a plan and we've discussed the transition potentially to a cashless society, or where we want to go, for the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to make sure that cash is issued, but also that cash is accepted, and that after that point, there may be separate streams that go on about inclusion and getting more people digitised and with bank accounts, etc., access to some kind of banking. But in the meantime, do you think there's an argument potentially to explore around that kind of obligation?
I'd hold off on the temporary idea, because I think certainly at the level of government ensuring cash is in circulation, and so looking at that bit, the reasons I feel so strongly about it are because I believe that cash speaks to some of the human rights that we have, and so therefore temporary engagement with regard to human rights, I would say, is not appropriate. It's human rights are human rights, and in this case it's a human right to privacy, and it's also to freedom. Yeah. I think when I spoke in the States on this matter, I kind of was looking at the European Central Bank, which has a really useful webpage. I'll happily send you the link. But as it says the bank itself says cash ensures your freedom and autonomy. Banknotes and coins are the only form of money that people can keep without involving a third party. And that also says it ensures your privacy. Cash transactions respect our fundamental right to have our privacy, data and identity protected in financial matters. And the reason for that is it goes back to that thing. Cash is the only form of money that doesn't involve a third party. Okay. Every other form of money, every electronic form of money involves a third party. And that means that your freedom and your privacy are impinged upon. In a democratic society, which is operating as we are at the moment, that's not really a problem. But as I was explaining to somebody just earlier today, I was brought up towards the tail end of the Cold War, and I saw how governments and societies can turn on each other and destroy that right to privacy. And so I definitely come from that way of thinking that there must always be privacy from government. And electronic payments do not enable that.
Could you not argue in reality, though, when cash definitely involves third parties, you need somebody to issue the cash, you need a government, you need a bank to...
But not in the transaction itself.
No, but you need a bank to take the cash out from, and then you also presumably need, if you want to pay that cash in to use it in any other form, you need to pay it into a bank or
Or you can keep it under your mattress.
You could.
And people do, not necessarily under their mattresses, but people do store them at home, cash at home. And it's interesting, again, going to Europe. Europe has got statistics on the amount of cash that has been stored at home. And interestingly, I believe it's grown over the last few years as a proportion of the amount of cash that's used. Yeah. So people do store cash at home. And to be honest, at the moment, I can assume, I have debit cards, etc. on my phone. I can access my bank account on my phone. But if there were ever any problems with either telecommunications networks or those apps, etc., I would be shut out of accessing my money. The only time you can access money 100% with 100% surety is when you have that cash in your hand.
And that's I will pass over to Debbie Southern in a moment, but it's fine having that cash under the mattress, and there are all sorts of problems potentially with that as well.
Way of banking.
In terms of
it is the old-fashioned way, but it still works.
I mean, there are problems about devaluing of currency and not getting interest, and also it's susceptible to being eaten by moths or burning if the house burns down. But if we put all that aside,
bank runs are bank runs, So.
Yeah, if we put all that aside, what's the point in having all that cash if you can't spend it in the economy because no shops and no businesses are accepting the cash?
I mean, that's one of the things, and that then speaks to your earlier question about whether we should be regulating around businesses. Because, yes, if you cannot spend your cash in businesses, that would wipe out a large reason for you having cash. But the truth is as well, and poor Deputy Southern, I used him as an example when I said, in the States, if I want to buy Deputy Southern's cup, because you happen to have a cup in front of you for £5, it's entirely between me and him if I wish to do that, and I can pay for it in cash. And I can buy that cup, and that's between me and Deputy Southern. That's a private transaction. It's not involved a business. And so you would still have private transactions which are enabled through cash, although I would say that businesses are where most of us would spend our cash.
Yeah.
But how you say earlier, we haven't got a policy on what happens there.
Or we have a policy by default might be a better way of saying it. In the sense of
we still hang on to it. I promise to pay the bearer on demand, etc. And that still exists, and that's that piece of paper that you use. Do we need a policy? And if so, when would you envisage that we need a policy by?
I mean, it's very difficult to say if and when. Personally, I think we do need a policy to ensure that government continues to produce cash, to make cash available to society. I do think that's something that we do need. I think we then need to have a real discussion with the business community and with islanders about whether businesses should be obliged to accept cash or not. Because at the moment, our policy by default is one, because we haven't got a policy, by default, the policy is it's up to businesses to choose whether they want to accept cash or not. So there is a policy by default.
And what's the timescale on that? Is it short, medium, long term? Are we talking?
I mean, it's difficult. It's interesting. It's almost impossible to say when will all businesses stop accepting cash. But what we can say is that in Jersey in 2021, there was 116 or almost 117 million pounds in Jersey currency in circulation. That was 2021. By the end of 23, that had fallen to 97 million pounds. And so far this year, we're at 90 million. So it might reach, I'm guessing, around the 97 million again. But we can see in the last 3 years, there's been a significant drop in the amount of cash that's in circulation in Jersey. But there's still 90 million. But yeah, from 117 down to 90, or 97 in 3 years, 2 or 3 years, is significant and fast. I think we're seeing single-figure percentages. I think I kept some of these. I think we're seeing single-figure percentages around the amount of cash that's been taken in government. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, 9%.
Yes, in the UK, for instance, in 2007, so this is UK stats, 67% of transactions included cash. The UK is now saying in 2023, 14% of transactions used cash. So that's a massive drop-off. And so but that doesn't mean that businesses aren't accepting cash, it just means that people aren't using it. You know, I make these arguments about the government should ensure that cash is in supply, whilst knowing that the 90+% of my personal transactions are made electronically.
But, yeah, I mean, in terms of choice, though, it's an interesting one because often our consumer behaviour is led by business preference, isn't it? So if you go to the co-op one day, use them as an example, there are other retailers available, and all of a sudden there is only a self-scan checkout. You don't really have a choice, and if the checkout says we don't take cash, you don't have any choice.
Yeah.
So to what extent? Well, I don't know what the question is there, but and I'm supposed to ask questions. But to what extent is it fair to talk about consumer choice when, in fact, often our decisions are led for us?
Well, that's correct, and that's one of the trends that I feel is happening to us. Is, again, I'll speak personally. Why the big move to electronic payments? Part of it is consumer convenience. It's easy. I have one phone. I can, rather than having a number of cards on me and things like this, or cash in my wallet, which I could lose or have stolen. So there is an element of consumer convenience, but there's also the element that cash is much easier for electronic payments are much easier for banks to handle. It costs less for banks to handle electronic payments. And certainly from a government perspective, it's much easier for government to handle and cheaper for government to handle electronic payments. And so there is consumer convenience, but my personal view is that most of this change is probably being led by institutions that prefer electronic payments because it makes their lives enormously easier. But of course, there's a cost. Every time you use your credit card, there's a cost added to that credit card, borne usually by the business. But I'm sure those businesses then recycle that cost into the price that you pay. So it's potentially inflationary. I don't know if we've ever looked at that, but
So actually cash costs more. I know that sounds
No, it may well
counterintuitive
do.
slightly,
Yeah, no, that's
but the handling of cash actually is quite costly, whether that's time, insurance increases. So actually the reason businesses really are moving over to electronic transactions more is it's more productive, more efficient, and it generally actually costs less because of those productivity gains. Yes, there is a 2-3% charge, but actually that is borne out by cheaper, better, more efficient processes, particularly usually with smaller businesses as well. You don't have to go to the bank at the end of the day and spend another hour in a queue to deposit your cash, etc. So those cash handling charges are actually really quite high, sometimes 50% higher. Some research suggests 2 or 3 times higher, so 300-400% higher. So that is why businesses are driving that. But I think your initial assertion that it's probably businesses driving it rather than consumers is probably correct.
yeah, no, but that's really interesting. So it is less inflationary potentially to be
And
using
potentially
electronic
banks driving it as well, because the banks have certain practices. If you have to queue at a bank for an hour, clearly there
That's
are
costly
other
for
ways.
banks as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which actually then, because I know lots of people complain about not being able to access banks in person. And I think that then speaks to the other part, which is probably beyond the remit, but I think always worth having in mind, is when everything becomes electronic and online, people meet each other less. There's less social interaction around that as well. Whereas cash, because it has to be in person, creates other touch points for personal interaction.
And with some websites, there's no action at all.
No, absolutely
Trying
none
to
whatsoever,
get a
even when
refund
things go
back.
wrong.
My wife just spent 2 hours yesterday afternoon trying to get a refund for a missed flight, and agony.
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that the flip side to the privacy argument, though? If you're saying if you use contactless rather than cash, you don't have to interact with anyone else. You can go into a supermarket. You don't have to have eye contact with anybody. You don't have to talk to anybody. You can just walk in, buy your product off the shelf, and there's no human interaction taking your money, seeing what you've bought.
There's no human interaction, but that doesn't mean
There's no third party.
There is a third party because your payment card provider is your third party, and
But it's a machine that doesn't really care about what you're doing. Whereas if you go into a supermarket, buy cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey with cash, you might feel, well, I'm being really judged by the person behind the till, whereas you can do that Well, you can't actually, because you need to get your ID checked, so.
You do,
But
yeah.
maybe if you're buying something with high fat and sugar content. You,
I mean, for me, the privacy comes from the institutional lack of privacy. So it is the fact that that third-party payment provider can see exactly what you're doing. But also, I was speaking, I think this was with you earlier today, we were talking about how the shops themselves aggregate your spending data with all the others to understand how best to market to you, how best to target you as a customer. And while some people would see that as convenience in the way that ads that are served to you online are targeted for you, I'm again someone who turns off those cookies and says, no, have a guess at what I want. I don't want you kind of knowing what my preferences are or aren't. I'm a human being, and this institution over here that I have no relationship with should have no view on my personal preferences. That is where the privacy.
Well, we're on a sort of still on a philosophical point of view. Do you believe that non-acceptance of cash would be discriminatory?
Yes, I do. And I think particularly at the moment, because we have older people who we know find it difficult to not use cash. And, you know, I probably sit in the middle. I am middle-aged. Like I said at the very beginning, I was born into a world where cash and checks were the only form of legal tender. I'm now in a world where they're not, but I was young enough at that changeover to be okay at using electronic payments, not brilliant. And I forget the question now, but discrimination. But I do believe that it does make it harder for people who find using it it's not just age. There can be a variety of reasons that people find it difficult to use electronic forms of payment, and therefore I think it is absolutely discriminatory.
Could I just come in there? I won't answer any of the philosophical questions, but from an economic point of view, there's actually discriminatory bit that not everyone can access bank accounts, and not everyone can access the card element of bank accounts as well. So there is an actual economic discrimination element of that, financial exclusion, effectively, as a form of that, which is non-philosophical. It does actually occur. So if you were going down a non-cashless society, a cashless society, you would probably want to do some form of legislation that you have to be able to have access to the other forms, whatever it happens to be. And at that moment, this moment in time, that is not always the case. So there is an active form of discrimination as well as a philosophical, age-based, whatever else one as well. So,
can I pass over to Karen at the moment? We're happy to use first names, I think, even though it's a formal setting.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. So there were just 2 points, and it was just following on from the conversation. So the first thing was about just going back to your reference about the European position where people are actually generating or collecting more cash. Do you know, is there any data that we can look at that shows whether that's had an impact on businesses when there has been that kind of a shift, and is it significant? And the second question was really to just ask Charlotte, I would imagine in relation to the privacy issue, things like electronic point of sale is where the sort of privacy issue comes into its own, because it does actually capture preferences, allows people to be targeted for particular products and services. And so that choice then is compromised because people might feel more obligated when all of that marketing material starts to come forward to actually use their cash or use their resource in a particular way, and that their privacy isn't actually protected in the way that you would with cash.
There's a lot to unpack there as well. I don't know. I'll send you, with regard to the European, it's all from the European Central Bank. And because I thought it was interesting, as an institution, they're defending cash. And I thought that was quite interesting, given what I said just earlier about banking institutions being one of the drivers for kind of moving towards a cashless society.
Yeah.
So I thought it was interesting that the central bank has a lot of literature in defence of cash. I'll send you all those links. I don't know that there's any discussion of the impact on businesses from kind of people storing higher values of cash or not. One thing with regard to kind of electronic payments, as you were speaking, Deputy Wilson, I did think to myself, is another thing, is that payment information can be stolen. And whereas if I do a cash transaction with my supermarket today and I pay £50 in cash and off I walk, my wider bank account is not in danger. Whereas we have seen hacks that have happened to online retailers, major online retailers, Target being one of the most famous ones, where people's, in the US, where people's payment information, etc., is stolen. And then they have access, the criminals who do that have access to your bank accounts.
Yeah.
So there is a level of protection which isn't afforded from electronic transactions, particularly online electronic transactions, that is afforded through cash payments.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, shall I add to that? About, I think with the electronic payment systems at Till Point, there is, they're quite good now, very advanced. There's lots of capability. You can give money to charities, and there's surveys you can do and all sorts of things that you can feed into that, which you wouldn't be presented with if you were doing a simple cash transaction. So in terms of the welcome that you give to a consumer as a business, I think this whole discussion on consumer choice is really important, just at a level of businesses to be aware of how competitive it makes you or otherwise, because ultimately at the moment the consumer can choose to walk away with their 2 feet and go and spend their money or do their card transaction elsewhere if that's more welcome. And I think for businesses in general in the retail space, hospitality spaces, really when it's getting extremely competitive, extremely hard to do business, and you need a point of difference, that idea of really raising the bar on customer service, customer experience, making someone feel welcome and genuinely welcome in your space to transact with you is really important. And so that idea of choice then becomes very appealing for both sides in order to create that environment. So certainly when we're thinking about retail and hospitality and visitors to the island, who often, it should be said anecdotally, and I'm sure you've heard this from the businesses that you've interviewed as well, we do see visitors with cash. They like to transact in cash. So often the cash payments will go up over the summer season and then probably tail off. And again, this is kind of just us talking to businesses. But that kind of welcome space for people to spend money in the economy is something to be encouraged, I think, however we do that.
And I think as we've heard that evidence, and we also know, I think we've heard that certainly Central European visitors, French, German in particular, they do still like cash. And we've heard similar evidence from the Hospitality Association. Thanks for that. Who's next? I think we'll hand over to Max for the next.
Thank you, Chair.
Questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for being in attendance today. The panel received an anonymous submission that identifies that the dwelling licences can only be paid online, so it's a digital transaction. So I just want to know whether you have any concerns about the current process that exists and whether cash should be an option for people who are applying for a dwelling licence.
So I don't know that particular process, so I can't speak to that process on its own. But it is my view, personal view, that government should accept cash.
Yep.
And so in that respect, or check, it should be said. So in that respect, so I'm assuming dwelling licences, often the applications might come from outside the island, so sending cash in an envelope probably isn't how the government would or should be paid, I accept that. But a cheque in an envelope, in my view, would be appropriate for that. I don't think government, because government has to be available for all members of society, regardless of their, regardless of any of their individual characteristics.
Yep.
And therefore, as a result of appreciating government has to be there for everyone in our society or who wants to come to our society, it should accept cash.
Yep. Obviously, the States Assembly debated P10 2024, that's Deputy Stevenson's proposition. And I just want to know, have any discussions taken place since the proposition was debated between yourself and other ministers to ensure that cash is potentially used in future and so businesses can maybe, make payment using cash instead of having to rely upon, say, digital
So
parts
there,
of...
as I referred earlier, there haven't been any discussions around the policy around it.
No.
I think partly that's because, except perhaps for the dwelling licences that you spoke to, I think government appreciates that it does need to accept cash. And so, you know, speaking to customer and local services earlier, and they were saying that they do accept cash, though it is the vast minority of transactions which are cash. And as a result of feeling that pretty much most transactions in government now can be done by cash and electronically, I don't think there has been much discussion. But it does seem like you've put your finger on at least one transaction which can only be done electronically, and I would question that.
It was also highlighted, Minister, about cash potentially being more beneficial to our domestic economy compared to, say, maybe digital transactions, where, again, there could be transaction flows between parties in Jersey and maybe, you know, in European countries or the UK. And is that a view that you would agree with, or would you tend to disagree with those who would predicate the importance of cash?
No, I think
in that respect?
so. Obviously, Jersey's an international financial centre, and so there are many millions, and may I dare say billions, that flow in and out of Jersey, and obviously that's all electronic. So the vast, you know, when you think about Jersey as a society, the vast majority of transactions in Jersey and the amount are being done electronically, because that's the financial institutions in the islands with the money coming to and fro. As far as islanders are concerned, I'm not aware, and Tom, please feel free to correct me or jump in, I'm not aware that cash has a particular benefit economically, other than, to Charlotte's point, providing choice to customers. So if Jersey said, sorry, no cash accepted here, you know, how much would we lose from tourists that would perhaps otherwise have spent in the island, but now won't spend in the island because they, as Charlotte was saying, anecdotally, we believe a lot of tourists prefer to use cash.
Is it not, we'll put this to the Treasury Minister, and Tom, feel free to jump in as well, but all that cash that's being held at the moment, say there's 97 million in circulation somewhere, if all that cash couldn't be used anymore and all government had to pay that cash back, that's 97 million pounds the government's got to find effectively to repay those people. Is that the correct way to look at it?
And we do that.
And it's also 97 million pounds that's not on deposit getting interest.
Yes, but that would be £97 million not on deposit that we could use elsewhere as well. So there's an opportunity cost that we hold that to cover everything that's going on in the economy whilst it's circulating.
Does that money not need to be paid back? So all that cash that's in circulation, somebody owns that, and you'd have to, when they cash that into the bank and it's taken out of circulation, that money does effectively get removed, doesn't it? Because you've had to reimburse those people for that 97 million.
You have, but the transaction's coming out of the bank account at the same time. So there's like almost like a double account, double-head accounting. There's no actual loss to it overall from that point of view. But we do hold that money on our account that we could effectively choose to spend differently. You're right, though. There is interest rate benefits to that as well. It does get quite complex, and the Treasury probably are on firmer ground than I am.
Yeah, we'll look
it's
at
not
that
something
again.
that would be taken out of the economy as such.
All right.
I mean, but it is true that you're right. The 97 million pounds of cash at the moment there's a name of the fund. I've lost the Currency Notes and Currency Coinage Fund. That's right. And that earns interest and money.
But on a basic level, if you've got £1 million under your bed at the moment, and you put that money into the bank, then of course that money is no longer that goes back to the bank.
Yes.
And then that goes back into your own personal bank account. But if all that money is then removed, well, we'll ask the Treasury about that. So I think it does get slightly esoteric potentially very quickly.
I think there is a wider thing about the economy, though, and again, it's not that there shouldn't be cash, but the productivity and efficiency gains are quite significant for electronic money over cash. So for an economy as a whole, I think it is marginal, but economies are more productive with the electronic elements of it rather than cash. So there are macro gains. I think they're marginal for the electronic side rather than the cash side. I know there's been a lot of discussion about cash circulating, and it never gets diminished by the amount that the banks take off it, but it is diminished by the amount of productivity a company will lose is where it ends up. And ultimately, if you are paying for a mortgage or a bank loan or whatever happens to be, it does have to end up in the bank eventually. It can't circulate forever. So those gains actually aren't really there in the same way that people might think from a logical point of view that they are.
Thank you, thank you.
Sorry, can I just pick up on that point, Tom?
Yeah.
Because I think there is some uncertainty as to, is it productivity that we're talking about, or is it efficiency, and are they one and the same thing?
Efficiency is a form of productivity. Being more efficient with time is something that would add up to productivity. Those productivity gains would usually feed through to higher profits for businesses or lower prices. They can feed through to both elements. So there are gains, macro gains. That I do keep saying that I think they're quite marginal. I think they're less marginal for individual businesses, but I think at a macro level they become quite marginal.
And do you think, in terms of the old adage, I mean, picking up the minister's point about middle age, and I joined that club, you know, there was a concept of cash is king, isn't there? So what's happened in the economy to actually remove that as an important aspect of, you know, commerciality, if I can put it that way? Is it because the driver from business is that if you continue to use cash, you become less productive, but the impact on the consumer is not really felt as much in terms of, you know, customer benefit?
Again, so businesses will make those gains. They will have, therefore, more efficiency, which means they will have effectively more money in their business. They can pass that on as lower prices, or they can hold it as profits. Some businesses will have a business model that means that we distinctly offer both elements because we believe that attracts more customers into us than it would do if we were just one or the other as well. So those businesses having those choices, and those choices they individually make them hopefully as efficient as possible. Some people will just want a business model that is cash only. And quite an extreme business, but gambling much prefers, well, traditionally gambling, in particular racecourse, much prefers cash to the electronic model. The flip side to that is there is some evidence, I think it's the University of Adelaide, but I can firm that up and find that for you as a panel, that people will tend to spend more when they are electronic rather than cash. In fact, I think on the website there is actually advice on there that if you're in a cost of living crisis, try and stick to cash because you will tend to spend less, which I think would prove the sort of ulterior position of that.
So I think that's actually one of the really important parts when it comes to, we talked about discrimination earlier as well.
Budgeting.
It's not a direct form of discrimination, but some people find it harder to budget than others.
Yeah.
And there's no question that cash helps, and I believe, and certainly the ECB is telling me this here, it says it helps you keep track of your expenses. Right. Cash allows you to keep closer control of your spending, for example, by preventing you from overspending. And we do know that there are plenty of people who set themselves a budget by taking that amount of cash, let's say £200 in a week, withdrawing that from the bank and saying, this is my budget for the week. And then they spend that cash during the week. It is much, much harder to do that with electronic payments.
So people do end up spending more, which is not necessarily good for the individuals, but businesses will take some gains from that sometimes as well. There's just more being spent because people aren't.
I was just trying to draw the differences out between commercial benefits and customer benefit when it comes to the use of cash.
Yeah, Jeff? If you follow on from question 5, if that's all right.
Question 5. I'm way on 6 or 7.
Yeah. We've asked about discrimination, actually. So.
Yeah, we have actually done that one. Let's go on to this one then. What actions do you believe could be undertaken to enable islanders to adopt digital payments and digital inclusion?
To encourage who to adopt them?
Islanders.
Islanders, yeah.
So how good are we, efficient are we at training people in terms of the electronic means of spending that they're
So it's a very good question that I don't know the answer to. What I would say is, because of that kind of COVID transition year where so many people moved to using electronic forms of payment, I think most people in the islands are quite adept at making electronic payments. I do believe there are still people who find it difficult and don't understand how to do that, particularly to generalise, particularly amongst the older people in our society. But equally, there's another flip side to this, which is cash. We were just talking about it's easier to spend more when you're not using cash. Equally, it's easier to teach children about money when they have physical cash in front of them, and they learn to spend with that. And so cash is very useful in helping children learn financial literacy, full stop. The kind of esoteric concept of electronic payments makes it much harder to teach children financial literacy. So I don't know the answer to your question about how good we are at teaching people to use electronic payments, but I would say that even if perhaps we need to get better at that, there is a role for cash in teaching younger part of our population what money is and how money works. And cash makes that much easier.
I suppose the flip side, because a lot of the witnesses we've had who have all had slightly different perspectives about going cashless or the organic transition that seems to be happening in that direction. They talk about the need for inclusion and perhaps for some kind of government intervention rather than necessarily focusing attention on obliging businesses to take cash, is enabling those who might be marginalised and not have bank accounts or not have a method to pay electronically for something to be able to do that. They also cited the £100 card that was given under the previous government as being a potential model. So for example, an organisation which could be government-led could allow people to come and pay cash into a card that could be spent in the local economy. Do you think that's something which government could explore? Or
I mean, it could explore that. I don't know if it needs to. There is one quite well-known company in Britain which effectively the whole company is based on this idea of, you know, preloading a card.
But can you do that with cash though? That's the downside. You still need to have a way to transfer electronically.
Absolutely, you do, I believe. Yes, I hadn't thought about it from preloading it from us with cash. At the end, they would need to get rid of the cash element, but that would be one way of kind of breaking down the barriers to that system.
Okay, I'll pass over to Karen.
Yeah, okay. I just want to ask what your views are, Kirsten, on the whether or not you believe payment methods impact varying sectors of the community.
Well, they impact various elements.
Varying sections. So, for example, we've got a set of, as you've outlined, variable payment methods, and do any of those particular methods impact different sections of our society, negatively or positively?
I think they do. I think, again, we're talking about smaller groups. So whichever way, shape or form, they end up being the minority of people. Because I think it's safe to say, particularly around the growth in electronic transactions in Jersey, it's safe to say that the vast majority of people in Jersey are comfortable with electronic payments, how to do that, etc., and don't feel disadvantaged by doing that. I do think that people with particular disabilities, people who have difficulty with numeracy, etc., would find it difficult from, again, that idea of keeping track of your expenses. If you find numeracy difficult, keeping track of your expenses when it's purely numbers in your head as opposed to actual notes that you're handing over becomes a lot more difficult. I think older people who find just using electronic devices more difficult, I think that makes it harder. You know, it is interesting. I mentioned earlier that I'm middle-aged, you know, but I've noticed how even just using a screen is something I like to do less and less, as my kind of reading vision has definitely deteriorated during my 40s. And so I see immediately how I am preferring, as I get older, to revert to paper again. And so given that screens are often involved with electronic payments, that's something which makes me think that as you get older, it becomes harder and harder, because that's something I'm personally experiencing. And it's not just me. I speak to pretty much all my friends at the same age, and we're experiencing the same thing with
Yeah, I'm
regards
trying
to screens and
desperately hard
eyesight.
not to write anything on here. Do you think that it's the same, or what sort of impact it has on varying sectors of the economy differently as well?
It's very interesting. I think Charlotte mentioned retail and hospitality, and I think retail and hospitality, in the main, have found electronic payments very useful. I think it's helped them in many ways. Tom talked to the kind of the marginal efficiency gains, but they are there still. They may be marginal, but they're still there. So you can process more transactions more quickly. as long as you've got a good Wi-Fi connection, because I think we've all sat there waiting for the machine to authorise the payment as you find a Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think businesses are advantaged in the main through the use of electronic transactions, but through that efficiency side more than anything else. And also it's then quicker actually with your bookkeeping afterwards is a lot quicker. You can download directly from the bank rather than having to go through manually doing it, things like this. So I think there are significant advantages for businesses in using.
Okay. Are you aware, or do you know if there is any particular impact on charities?
No, I think there is.
Yeah.
I think number one, whilst and Charlotte mentioned this, it is possible to get card payment, kind of handheld card payment readers that charities can use. Almost anyone can use. So a charity isn't stopped from collecting money. Let's say a bucket on a Friday evening going around town, shaking a bucket, so to speak. They're not stopped from taking electronic payments. But I don't have any evidence around this. This is purely anecdotal in my feeling. I am on the board of a charity in Jersey, and so do hear this. I do think it disrupts that side of fundraising. I think people are happier to put £5 or £10 in a bucket. They're less happy to sit there and kind of do an electronic transaction. There's something about I was going to say the ceremony of it, and it's not a ceremony, it's not the right thing, but put it this way, you can't shake an empty bucket very successfully.
Yeah.
So,
it's
but it's the same as if you're at an arts and crafts fair and things like this.
Yeah.
I do think individuals and small organisations, particularly charities, are disadvantaged by a move towards purely electronic. I think there is a role for cash in that area particularly, and certainly, I don't know, I definitely find it easier to give £5 or £10 than it is to kind of make an electronic payment for that charity. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
something
It's
going
a
on.
psychological relationship with charity and money, isn't there? Could you tell us, I think you alluded to the time frame about, when the fall in cash would critically impact upon the acceptance of cash payments, and I think that's not certain and you can't really predict that. But we understand that some jurisdictions, such as Sweden, may have moved rapidly towards a cashless society, and it's been highlighted that they're now having to introduce sort of mitigating measures on that basis. So do you think, given the conversation we had earlier on, that we would be facing that kind of scenario? Do you think there is anything that we need to do to maybe prevent us having to mitigate against something and instead plan appropriately for the situation we find ourselves in?
This speaks very much to the chair's kind of questioning earlier on, and I was going to at some point mention Sweden because they're the largest nation I know of that have pretty much gone to electronic transactions, and I was fortunate to be in Sweden this summer. And it was about halfway through our week in Sweden that I commented to my wife that I've not even seen a Swedish banknote. We kind of arrived in Sweden on the plane and then just went into being in Sweden without thinking about the fact that I didn't see a single krona. It's krona, isn't it? Sweden. I didn't see a single coin. I didn't see a single note the whole week I was there. So in one sense, it was incredibly convenient. I didn't have to think about exchanging money, etc. I just carried on using my, check my bank statement for the transaction charges later. I'll be less enthusiastic about it. But it was interesting that I was there for a week and didn't see a single Swedish banknote or coin in my whole time there. I think we should, or if I may be as bold as say, the panel should look at the Swedish model and what is happening, because if they are having to bring in mitigation measures, it really does speak strongly to the chair's earlier point about there comes a point where it's going to be costly for you to keep cash and try to reverse engineer it a bit. So getting ahead of that is really important.
If I can come in on that point, there's potentially a tension in the sense that there might be a well-intentioned move to try and protect what in inverted commas are sometimes called the vulnerable or the marginalised, who either choose to use cash or can only use cash. But in catering for them, we might actually be making that worse by if we safeguard their ability to use cash, we might stop them from being brought into the mainstream of being able to use contactless payments like everybody else.
Yeah.
Did you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's a really valid point. I mean, I would accept the point there and then say, but privacy and freedom are 2 points that I don't think we should tread. We should disregard.
So it's your
and
position.
so you're not protecting. In my head, I'm not protecting it purely for minorities and vulnerable people.
Yeah.
I want to protect cash because I think cash speaks to two of our fundamental human rights, privacy and freedom, and therefore you should protect cash.
No, that's fine. Thank you for that. Can I carry on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've answered some of the questions already, or we dealt with them. An area I want to ask, I've been dying to ask a minister about, and I'll put the same to the Treasury Minister, is about what might be called the grey economy, the black market, whatever the current acceptable terms are, even illegal activity that is perhaps enabled or facilitated by the use of cash. Can you talk to us about that?
No.
Good. I mean, joking aside, the grey economy, if you like, the informal economy where people get paid cash in hand for work, which may or may not be then declared, and the tax may not be paid on it. That is still money that's in the economy.
Yeah.
It's still money that's circulating, and it presumably has an impact, and positive and or negative. What do you think?
That's right. The black and grey economies, the illegal economies, are still part of the economy. It is still, and again, please always jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but they are parts of the economy which we actually are terrible at recording, because obviously officialdom doesn't have a handle on those transactions. So there is a whole area of the economy which isn't being monitored but is of value, purely economic value. I was asked by the media a few months ago about, but doesn't cash just enable crime? Cash is used in crime, there's no question about that. But I think we've also seen that electronic payments don't reduce crime, in the sense that by moving from cash to electronic payments, there is no lessening of illegal transactions, there is no lessening of scams or frauds, there is no lessening of illegal substances in our society just because you're moving to an electronic form of payment. So whilst cash can often be used in crime, and I'm no doubt is, I don't think that by moving to a purely cashless society, you will suddenly see those transactions stopping. There's no evidence that I've seen so far to suggest that electronic payments are forcing illegal transactions, whether it's cash in hand for,
Know about that cash.
That's correct, but that's just one of, I put that down into the vast majority of people don't operate in that way. There is a minority of people who do operate in that way, or might operate in that way. And to me, that's you can never be 100%. There will always be 2, 3 or 4% which isn't working the way you want it to, and that will always be there.
Putting your minister hat back on for economic development, in term, and maybe a collective hat as well for the Council of Ministers, do you think that there are lots of strong arguments for going towards a cashless society in the short or medium term, and the benefits thereof for government?
I think for government, yes, and this is one of the reasons why I've spoken out about the need for government to affirm the need to keep cash in society. Because I think, along with banks, government has an interest in moving to electronic payments, because precisely for the reasons you've just said, if there are no cashless transactions, if there are no cash transactions in society, you can't pay someone in cash and then not declare it. It becomes very difficult. So I think government does have an interest in moving towards a cashless society, but I don't think that reason trumps your kind of privacy and freedom reasons. I just don't believe it does. And that's where, yes, I have a minister hat on. I can sit there and say it is in government's interest to move to a cashless society. But as a citizen of that society, I believe that my privacy and freedom is more important than the government's need to remove those transactions from society, those hidden transactions from society.
Even if it means that tax receipts are up and you've got more money to spend on public services and on stimulating the economy.
I will turn to Tom only in terms of, I doubt Tom will be able to answer this. My guess is that is very marginal, although it's all probably impossible to record, that I don't think the increase in revenue to government would be of such a large amount that I should lose my privacy and freedom for it. That's how I believe it is. Tom, tell me about the whether
No,
that's marginal or not.
I would think it is more so in Jersey than it would be in other jurisdictions. Our tax rates are lower. So GST is much lower than VST. If you're talking about businesses, our marginal rates of income tax are generally lower than most other places. There's a less of a benefit to withhold information in terms of putting that information out there back to the government of tax fraud, I suppose, than there might be in other places. So I am sure it will happen. You know, I think it's 99.9% sure it will be happening, but I think it will be more marginal than it is in other jurisdictions as well. So there would be an increase, and there's a lot of statistics and a lot of academia that says that government has gained significantly from that transfer from cash to electronic payments for those very reasons. I think it's in the tens of billions of pounds in the UK. But again, you transfer that to Jersey, where the gains are less for individuals and we're a smaller economy, it's not going to be as sizable at all. Is my suspicion, based on sort of economic theory rather than actual evidence, because we just wouldn't have that evidence.
Okay, thank you. That's all from me. Max, have you got any?
Yes. There's obviously been some discussion among states members about consumer lending legislation for the last 2 or 3 years, and I just want to know your thoughts, Minister, on whether Jersey should be introducing such legislation to protect consumers, and if not, why not?
I'm looking for the tangent to the catch. So consumer lending, it's interesting. I think the private lending market in Jersey is really important. And again, speaking to Tom in the past, not recently, it's got to be said, you know, I think Jersey probably has a greater amount of private lending going on than than the UK or other developed societies. So I think it's important that if you do have consumer lending regulation being brought in, it has to be brought in a way which doesn't disrupt all of that lending. There's another reason as well, and I'll come off a conversation I had last night with a business person in Jersey. And that was, this person runs a business in the care sector. This person went to local banks for lending to develop their business, and could not find a local retail bank that would lend to them because of the type of business they were in.
I see.
One of the banks actually said, we only lend to businesses that have 2 of these types of facilities. You've only got 1, therefore we won't lend to you. And so this person has had to go to the private sector for lending, because if they didn't, they would not have been able to invest in their business.
I see.
But the interest rate that person is spending is paying is far in excess of an interest rate that you would pay in a retail bank in Jersey. And so I have significant concerns about the ability of Jersey's banks to actually do what businesses in Jersey need them to do. This is something I've raised several times with banks themselves. I don't believe we've got to the bottom of it. And so I'd be much more comfortable with significant consumer lending regulation once we were sure that the mainstream banks were actually serving all elements of Jersey society properly. At the moment, I don't think they are. Therefore, we do need private lending. Therefore, if we do bring consumer lending in regulation, it shouldn't be too onerous. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have it, because I also appreciate, again, speaking to Tom in the past, I've asked Tom, how do we know what capital flows around the island? Well, because there's no regulation around consumer lending, private consumer lending, we don't know all the capital that's flowing around the island. And these are statistics that most governments would have to hand, but we don't really have that to hand, because there is a significant amount of private lending. So I would be cautious about bringing customer lending regulations, consumer lending regulations, but I think it's important because of the nature of Jersey's economy.
Because the panel has heard from the council, what they called?
Consumer Council?
Chamber of Commerce it was, sorry, yesterday. Yeah, there was 2 representatives from the Chamber of Commerce, and also there was Liberty Bus as well. So 2 stakeholders who come before the panel, and they mentioned about how costly it was to administer cash within their business.
Tom's point.
And, other business owners have also, inferred the same thing. So we seem to be seeing this more predominant use of digital transactions, and with that obviously comes the risk of fraud, but electronically as well. So do you think there currently is maybe some loopholes that exist in Jersey, and do you think there is potentially remit to try and maybe adopt legislation to ensure those weaknesses are addressed as well?
Yeah, just quickly, I need to apologise. I answered with regard to private lending as opposed to consumer
Consu-
lending.
ah,
It's my fault.
Don't worry, that's fine.
So we're talking more about credit cards, things like this. I apologise.
Can I just come in on the fraud issue first? It's probably not recognised that highly, but fraud in a cash society is generally much higher. People skimming off the top, pound coins here and there when it's high levels of cash.
Yeah.
Whether that, I'm not pointing any fingers at any particular group of people,
No.
whether that's on a bus count or emptying a parking machine, or it's quite easy to do. And local authorities, I know this, I can't speak for government of Jersey, but I know that local authorities in the UK were losing tens of thousands of pounds on a regular basis from that kind of fraud. So fraud happens digitally, but it is more secure.
Yep.
Fraud is much easier when cash handling comes into the thing. So it's not as widely seen or widely reported, but that is something that used to happen all the time. It's reported a lot less these days because there's a lot less cash happening, and therefore there's less opportunity. But that, when you talk about fraud, you tend to think about digital. It happens in cash as well, and it used to happen in quite high degrees as well. So it's important just to make sure you, in your head, you kind of countering those two things off.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr.
Yeah, no, that was... sorry, I was leaving the
Oh, okay.
someone's answer.
Sorry, Chair.
Carry on. I mean, I was just going to ask about cash. So it still happens now. Sometimes you'll be charged more for a card transaction if it's below a certain amount. It's a lot less than it used to be in the past. But there's only one business I know in Jersey which charges people more if they use cash for the same service than if they pay by card. Okay. And I don't need to mention them, but it is in the public domain. Do you have any thoughts about if that became commonplace for people to be given a surcharge to pay for cash? Is that something that you would be concerned about, or that you would just say it's down to businesses, it's fair play?
It would be something I'd be concerned about. And again, I think this probably speaks to my generation and my experience through life, in that I definitely have that concept in my mind that cash is the basis of our consumer money, if you know what I mean. So the idea that you would then charge people for using cash, as much as I appreciate everything Tom's just said about there are extra costs around cash, because in my mind cash is the basis of your consumer money. I feel it would be wrong, kind of at that moral level, to charge for using cash. Though I can understand economically, it costs more. Therefore, there's an economic reason to charge more.
Thank you. I know that we're coming towards the end of the session, but we've still got just under 15 minutes. So, Karen, can I pass over to you?
Okay. Thank you.
Come back to that.
Minister, noting the recently publicised closure of some bank branches, do you have any points to raise on individuals or businesses' ability to access cash processing services through ATMs, cashback or bank branches?
I mean, yes, as bank branches are reduced, it makes it harder for businesses to access their facilities, to deposit cash, to withdraw cash for their floats in their tills. And certainly, I mean, it's interesting, Deputy, you mentioned cashback, and I'd almost forgotten that cashback was a facility because I haven't seen it used in such a long time. So I think, yes, those services are diminishing, and it does make it harder for, I mean, obviously a bank that shut recently was in St. Brelard. If your business in St. Peter or St. Brelard or St. One, you've now got to travel a lot further to put your cash into the bank than you did before, thus adding again to the kind of lack of efficiency around that. So that is having an impact.
Okay. Do you think, I believe part 2 of the Financial Services and Markets Act 2003, that there is some legislation concerning access to cash withdrawal? It's about protecting access to cash. Do you think we need to actually look at that legislation and consider whether there's any changes needed for that?
Is this UK legislation?
This is part of, I'll just double check.
It would be, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
it
guessing
is.
as
UK.
it ended in Act, I'm assuming it's UK
Yeah,
legislation.
it is, yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
I don't know if we have any similar legislation in Jersey. I'd have to, again, Treasury would be a better place to answer.
Would you
But
consider
it's interesting that they
Yeah.
might have those protections in the UK.
Yeah.
And it, perhaps, given where we're heading and given my personal view about the importance of maintaining cash in society, it might be that we do need to look at protecting the ability to withdraw cash.
Yeah, okay. Have you got any other further reflections or comments to make on the impact of reducing access to cash on social exclusion, social inclusion, and how this might be addressed in policy terms?
I think a really good example of a group of people who find it hard to access banking facilities is former prisoners. When people leave prison, a lot of them don't have bank accounts and they find it harder to access bank accounts. It's why an institution like the Community Savings Bank in Jersey is so important, because there are people who find it really hard to access bank accounts. And, you know, just think about the amount of kind of due diligence procedures that you have had to do as an individual, where you've had to provide a bank statement as proof of your address and things like this. It's very, very difficult to do that if you don't have a bank account to receive a bank statement from. So I think at the moment, certainly, there are kind of unbanked people in the island, and they really do need cash in order to operate within society. So if we are to move further down the electronic payments only road, then we need to think very, very carefully about the impacts on those people and how we make sure that those people aren't marginalised, if that's the road Jersey chooses to go down.
Just to go down, okay. We did hear from them this morning with some very similar views around that. There's also been mention of undertaking actions such as setting up banking hubs. What are your views on this?
Yes, this was mentioned in the States last week.
Yeah.
And I believe it was, I believe this has happened elsewhere. I think, you know, again, I understand the kind of economic reasons why banks are closing branches, particularly when there are fewer cash transactions, fewer customers appearing in person in those banks. And the banks themselves are, as we all know as bank customers, banks are trying to get us to work online a lot more, etc., and so on. But there is still a role for personal access to a bank. And Jersey is a small place, but I do appreciate that if you're living in the west or you're living in the east, you coming into town is not always easy, and therefore I can see why there would be a good role for banking hubs in the west and the east of the island particularly, in order to enable people to access their services, not just cash, but any services from their banks in person. And you know, sometimes you want to have that conversation. We're talking about some of the most, you know, we're talking about our own private transactions, and so you don't want to have that conversation with typed in on a computer, or with somebody who's living somewhere else and you don't even know what country you're calling them in. So I think it is really important. Again, I come back to the privacy element of this, and I think not having access to bank branches reduces people's ability to talk privately.
Have you given, and I know it's only a recent suggestion, but have you got any ideas of how, if those ideas were to be progressed, what that might entail at all?
I will have to do the research. I think there are other places where this has happened. This happens, and so I think it would be using an existing model.
Yeah.
You know, different banks, different banks in terms of different companies, but one physical location. And it might be that it's Bank A on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Bank B on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or they may be able to cohabit at the same time. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that there are other examples of this happening. So it would be a case of using existing models. I think if I could just, before I forget it, going back to the privacy point, possibly all of us except for Tom and Charlotte would know this, we are known as politically exposed persons to our banks, as we're elected members of society. And I had an interesting phone call from a bank recently where they wanted to check, you know, their kind of due diligence, which in itself is fine. But the person at the other end of the phone started going through my bank transactions, speaking to my wife about, why have you made this payment? What's this payment for? And that, I think, speaks really strongly to the privacy element. This person wasn't even in Jersey. So there is somebody else I know elsewhere in the world who's going around with knowledge of my and my wife's bank transactions. I find that abominable. I don't think that should ever be the case. And that's why I speak strongly to the need for privacy and trust. I do worry that younger generations brought up on electronic, just social media and just using devices all the time, undervalue privacy. I speak to looking at the Cold War from afar, and understanding that what I was being told was how the loss of privacy, the government and institutions were in everybody's living room and in everybody's kitchen. And that's what forms my idea of privacy, that if you lose it, then should we, we're lucky, we live in a democratic society, but we can't know that will be the case forever.
No.
We see in other countries that we thought were bastions of democracy, how democracy is under threat. And to hand over that privacy to governments means you risk handing over that privacy to authoritarian regimes.
Is the risk not that it's not government that's the problem, it's actually private interests? So people are handing over their private information willingly to companies. So when you get a shop card for a supermarket, people will scan their card even when they're not getting a discount to that same supermarket. So is it not a risk that it's actually
Yeah, that is part of it. But again, I think we need to help our younger generations understand the value of privacy.
Yeah.
At that level.
But what I'm saying is it's not the communist conspiracy where the big brother is the government anymore.
It can be either.
It's the
but
it's a corporation.
In the worst of all worlds, it's both.
Both, yeah. We're drawing, I think, to an end, and we don't want to go over too much. Can I ask the fundamental question? I suppose is that we've heard, I think, your views loud and clear, and that they've been, I think, it's fine. It's refreshing, and ultimately we'll be making some form of findings and recommendations, clearly on the basis of the evidence we've received. One of those recommendations may be around securing people's access to cash and their ability to spend cash in the economy. So from what you've said, I think it's fair to say you're a strong advocate for cash for various reasons. At what point, so if we were to make a recommendation to you as Minister saying that you or the government should oblige businesses to take cash, would that be something you would enact?
Certainly, if the states told me to, I would. It'd be something I'd be really keen to debate and understand. I think.
And if the scrutiny panel made that recommendation that you should bring forward,
I would absolutely. I would take that recommendation. I would consult with businesses as well to understand their concerns.
Yeah.
But
the businesses would tell you not to, though. They've told us that loud and clear.
Islanders as well, have they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't
I wasn't
interfere
aware
with
of that.
business.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. And we may know.
No, it's something I would. I've got to put my big boy pants on here, and it is one of those things where I've said even myself there was, my main thrust has been about making sure government makes cash available as opposed to determining that businesses should take cash. I would definitely be willing to reflect upon that. Whether I would actually push to bring it in, I don't know right now, because there is that part of me which just says more regulation, more regulation. I'd really like to look at how the EU, with their directive, and how that's impacted, because last I checked, the EU hadn't imploded quite yet because it made people take cash, it made businesses take cash. But it'd be something I'd be really willing to explore with a view to wanting to bring it in.
Thank you.
But it'll be interesting.
Yeah. Just so you know, from our perspective, the vast majority of submissions and questionnaire responses have indicated not only being in favour of cash, but also being in favour of government intervention to ensure the acceptance of cash in wider society. We accept that it's also self-selecting and that people with strong views might seek to respond. And the overwhelming business response so far has been that government shouldn't interfere in the running of business. So there's clearly a tension there.
There is, yeah.
Which we will take into
Hence the big
consideration.
boy
We'll weigh
comment
up
I
the
made.
evidence.
I'm going to have to man up and get weighed into the fight, I think.
Indeed, but we'll weigh your evidence in that as well, on your comments, and we look forward to hearing from certainly the Treasury Minister shortly, and possibly even the Home Affairs Minister, because we've got some questions around the grey and illegal economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If I could also, just purely anecdotally, but since we mentioned this in the States a few months ago for the first time, this has definitely been the issue that I've been stopped in the street most on, and from people supporting the move to keep cash. So I found that interesting as well, just as an individual politician. I found it interesting that people are willing to stop me in the street and say, we really want you to keep cash.
Yeah. Thank you. Ed, do you have any further comments or considerations from your officers? Tom looks like he's poised to.
No, not at all.
Anything about retail or?
No, I think we've said it all
Yeah.
in terms of the consumer choice really, and how that plays out in your recommendations will be interesting, because you've obviously had lots of feedback from businesses, from consumers, and how that balances. And like you said, there is a tension there.
There is definitely a tension.
It'll be interesting to see what conclusions you draw.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your time and your considerations. I think they've been thoughtful and helpful to the panel. And unless anyone else has got a question.
I'll just say, I'd like to thank you for picking this up. I think this is, one of my concerns since I became States Member is there's not a great deal of space for policy discussion and really unravelling concepts and thoughts, and that's what I think you're doing with this cash issue, and I think it's absolutely the right way to go about matters. You picked up something which does matter to people, but which has a lot of conflicting tensions, has a lot of evidence and other models, and so by bringing it all together through scrutiny, I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.